Racist cop slaps the wrong black judge. Minutes later, her empire begins to crumble. Judge Ayanna Brooks had always been a force of calm precision. At just 43, she was already a pillar of justice in the heart of Dallas, a woman whose voice commanded courtrooms, whose rulings shaped policy, and whose very presence intimidated those who abused power. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for corruption. Yet nothing in her long career had prepared her for the moment she was struck across the face by someone sworn to uphold the very law she defended. The slap, loud, deliberate, and caught on camera, was delivered by Sergeant Valerie Kincaid, a veteran officer with a gleaming badge and a history of buried misconduct. Kincaid, revered in certain circles for her tough-on-crime stance, carried herself with the swagger of someone who believed she was untouchable. Her alliances stretched from the mayor's office to deep-pocketed developers who saw justice as a formality. And in her eyes, Judge Brooks was an obstacle, one that needed to be intimidated, silenced, or removed. But the woman Kincaid struck wasn't just a judge. She was the daughter of civil rights attorneys, the first black woman to preside over the city's appellate division, and a mentor to countless young lawyers who believed in the power of law to heal. Kincaid had mistaken decorum for weakness. She had no idea that her one impulsive act would trigger a chain of revelations that would raise her career and the network of influence she'd built around it to the ground. It began with a routine case. A young black man, 16, charged with obstruction and loitering. The arresting officer? Valerie Kincaid. The evidence? A shaky claim backed by questionable footage and a paper-thin report. Judge Brooks, overseeing the bail hearing, requested the body cam footage. What she saw was chilling. The boy, Marcus Langley, had simply been sitting outside a convenience store, waiting for his cousin. No altercation, no threat, nothing warranting an arrest, let alone the bruises on his arms. Brooks questioned the arrest's validity in court, pressing Kincaid during testimony. The sergeant's answers were curt, defensive. At one point, she insinuated that Brooks was too lenient, too soft on criminal elements. The gallery fell silent. Brooks responded not with anger, but with quiet authority. The Constitution does not bend for your convenience, Sergeant. Nor will I. That night, as Brooks left the courthouse, Kincaid confronted her in the parking garage. Words were exchanged, heated, bitter. Then came the slap. A single, sharp crack that echoed off the concrete walls. Cameras from a nearby news crew caught the act. The footage went viral before sunrise. By morning, the city was on fire. Protesters lined the courthouse steps. Civil rights attorneys demanded Kincaid's arrest. The mayor called for calm, but his voice was drowned by chants of justice for Judge Brooks. News anchors replayed the footage in a loop, dissecting every frame. Kincaid, once protected by layers of influence, found herself isolated. But Ayanna Brooks didn't stop at pressing charges. She knew this was bigger than her cheek, bruised though it was. With quiet resolve, she handed over years of sealed complaints. She'd collected reports that hinted at a pattern. Kincaid targeting young black men, fabricating probable cause, coercing witnesses. Most of those cases had never reached internal affairs. Some had been dismissed outright. But Brooks kept records. Names. Dates. Patterns. The district attorney launched a formal investigation. What followed was a cascade of revelations. Whistleblowers came forward, officers, clerks, even former partners. They spoke of Kincaid's threats, her backroom deals, her quiet role in gentrification campaigns that used arrests to drive out poor residents from developing neighborhoods. Emails surfaced, bank records, confidential memos. Then came the grand jury. Kincaid was indicted not only for the assault, but for civil rights violations, conspiracy, falsifying reports, and obstruction of justice. Developers she once dined with disavowed her. Council members who'd praised her now demanded her resignation. And in her darkest hour, Kincaid lashed out. She accused the system of betrayal. She called Brooks a radical in robes. She insisted she was framed. But no one listened. In the courtroom, stripped of her badge and power, Kincaid watched as one former ally after another testified against her. Officers described how she manipulated crime statistics. A data analyst revealed how reports had been doctored. A young mother recalled how her son was jailed for a broken tally after refusing to sell his family's home to a developer connected to Kincaid's political patrons. And then came Marcus Langley. He stood before the jury and simply said, "I was just waiting for my cousin." His voice cracked, but his truth rang louder than any lawyer's argument. It was the final nail. Kincaid was convicted. 5 years in federal prison, with more charges pending. But her sentence wasn't just time, it was exposure. Her fall lit a torch that others carried. Investigations spread through City Hall. Resignations followed. Judges reevaluated old cases she'd been involved in. Communities once silenced found their voice. And Judge Ayanna Brooks? She returned to the bench. Quietly, without fanfare. But her presence carried new weight. In neighborhoods once plagued by fear, her name became a symbol not of revenge, but of resolve. She gave speeches at schools. She helped train new officers on ethics. She rewrote the code of conduct for court procedures involving police testimony. A new generation rose in her shadow. One that believed justice didn't have to shout, didn't have to slap. It just had to stand. And so it did. Months passed, but the echo of the slap never faded from the city's memory. In some corners of Dallas, murals appeared painted on brick walls and community centers depicting a faceless judge with a gavel splitting open a web of corruption. The image became iconic, a visual testament to what had been endured and what had been exposed. Meanwhile, Judge Ayanna Brooks kept her life deliberately grounded. She declined national interviews. She turned down book deals. When a major news network offered to produce a feature-length documentary about the trial, she responded with a polite but firm, "Let the facts speak for themselves." Her focus remained on the bench, where real work still needed doing. Cases continued to flow in evictions, juvenile offenses, immigration disputes, domestic violence. In each, she brought the same exacting fairness. But something had changed. Her name now carried weight, even outside the courtroom. When Ayanna questioned evidence, prosecutors listened more closely. When she raised an eyebrow at a vague arrest report, defense attorneys knew a window had opened. In neighborhoods like South Oak Cliff and Pleasant Grove, residents who once felt ignored by the legal system began showing up to court not just for their own hearings, but to observe, to support, to testify. Local barbershops and salons buzzed with conversations about justice, not just gossip. Churches held legal literacy nights, and Ayanna sometimes attended in secret, sitting quietly in the back, her notebook in hand. But not everyone was eager to see change. Inside the police department, resistance simmered. There were still officers who whispered about her ruling on Marcus Langley's case. Some blamed her for crippling law enforcement morale. A few even argued she had endangered the city by pushing political correctness. But those voices, once dominant, were no longer the only ones in the room. Deputy Chief Nolan Reyes, one of the first ranking officials to openly support Ayanna during the Kincaid scandal, began implementing reforms. Officers were retrained in community-based policing. De-escalation workshops became mandatory. Anonymous reporting lines were established, and a new oversight board, this one with actual subpoena power, was formed, with Judge Brooks consulted on its creation. Meanwhile, Valerie Kincaid sat behind bars, awaiting her corruption trial. Her cell in the federal holding facility was small and bare, the metal bed unforgiving. At first, she believed her old allies would come through donors, councilmen, developers. But as the weeks turned into months, her calls went unanswered. Her lawyer visited less frequently. Her appeals gained no traction. In private, Valerie scribbled notes, furiously drafting manifestos, listing names of those she believed had turned on her. In court, she remained defiant. She even claimed the slap was exaggerated, that Brooks had manipulated public sympathy. But the footage remained undeniable. It had not just shown a moment of violence. It had captured her downfall in real time. When the corruption trial began, the courtroom was even more crowded than the first. This time, the charges weren't just about abuse of force, they were about bribery, conspiracy, falsified reports, and racketeering. Prosecutors introduced evidence that Kincaid had worked in concert with a real estate firm, intentionally boosting arrest numbers in key neighborhoods to scare out longtime residents. Emails confirmed her communication with city planners. A former assistant testified that she'd been instructed to clean up certain blocks ahead of new zoning announcements. And again, Judge Ayanna Brooks sat in the gallery, watching not as a victim, but as a citizen seeking truth. When a verdict came guilty on all counts, a courtroom didn't erupt. There was no cheering, just a solemn silence, as if the room itself understood the weight of what had just happened. The judge presiding over the case sentenced Valerie Kincaid to 23 years in federal prison, citing the egregious betrayal of public trust and weaponization of law enforcement for personal and political gain. Outside, Ayanna stood quietly under the overhang of the courthouse steps, listening to the patter of light rain. A reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Judge Brooks, any final thoughts on today's outcome?" She paused, looking past the cameras toward a group of young law students gathered at the edge of the crowd. "Yes," she said calmly. "This wasn't about a slap. It was about a system. And if we've begun the process of rebuilding that system on truth, then we're doing the work our city needs." She turned and walked away. Weeks later, Dallas voted to implement citywide police accountability measures. The mayor's office, under pressure, appointed a civilian liaison team. Developers connected to Kincaid's deals were fined and banned from future contracts. Schools across the city invited Judge Brooks to speak not about the scandal, but about integrity. She always arrived alone, often declining a podium. Instead, she sat at eye level with students and told them the story not of power, but of choices. And so, in a city that had once blurred the line between badge and privilege, justice was no longer just an ideal. It had a name, it had a face, and it had endured.